God's good. God is good. Let's open up our Bibles to the book of Ruth, chapter 1. Hope everybody's having a good day. We're blessed to be here. Blessed to be in Christ Jesus. So blessed to have our brother Galen here, sitting here with us today. Love this brother very much. God is good. We've all heard the phrase, desperate times call for desperate measures. Right? I mean, I think all of us have heard it. All of us have probably said it, and probably some of us have even practiced it at times. And you know, what it really means is this, and when you know, you get caught between a rock and a hard place, when you get in a difficult circumstance, sometimes you do things that you normally wouldn't. Right? And sometimes that can be innocent, right? I mean, it can be like, if you're not the type of person that asks for help, when hard times come, guess what you do? You decide to ask for help. But what that normally means when people use that is that you're willing to break the rules in order to get things done the way you want them done, or whatever you're in need of, right? And you know, recently I was listening to a Sunset instructor who was talking about really digging into the background and the opening of a letter or a book and find out what's really going on at that time. And he made some references to the book of Ruth, and I kind of went in there and really dug in and seen things that I hadn't seen before. And that's kind of the thing, that's kind of the phrase that I thought about as I started to really dig into these opening verses of you know, hey, when in desperate times calls for desperate measures. That was kind of the thinking of this Israelite man here. And then what do you do, right? What do you do when everything falls apart, right? When everything blows up in your face, when life doesn't go according to plan, when you think you see how things are going to go and they go totally opposite. And I think as we get into this book, I've seen things that I didn't see, but it starts out here in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And just right there, I stopped because I said, well, I really want to ask myself a question as a Bible student, is why is there a famine? Right? Because the book of Ruth happens at the same time as the book of Judges, right? I mean, it tells us in the days when the judges were ruling, and if you go back and a lot of the commentators are going to tell you, this story happens very early in the time of the book of Judges. And why is that significant? Because what happens right before the book of Judges? Right? The people of Israel have finally entered the promised land. And what has God been saying about the promised land? As He's called Abraham to leave his country and to go where He shows them, and over He's been telling His people, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to take you to this land. And what does He say about the land? It's going to be a land filled with milk and honey, right? I mean, that's what He says. And then He says things like, you know, I'm going to bless you when you come. I'm going to bless you when you go. Matter of fact, He says nations are going to rise up against you, and they're not going to be able to overcome you because I won't allow them. Matter of fact, He says you're going to go and live in cities that you didn't build, and you're going to reap crops that you didn't plant. But if you remember in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 30, as He's bringing the people closer and closer, He tells them all those wonderful things about this land and how great it's going to be. But then there's this two-letter word, and He says, if you stay faithful to me and you follow my commandments. And of course we get to Judges. So I turn to Judges chapter 2 to kind of remind myself that the Israelites had finally entered the promised land, and it was everything that God said it was going to be. But then you get to Judges chapter 2 and verse 10, and not long after they're in the land, it says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord or what He had done for Israel. It says, then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served Baals. They forsook the Lord and took of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods and of the people around them, and aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook Him and served Baal and the Ashereth. In the anger of the Lord against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of the raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around them. They were no longer able to resist them. And even when you get to the very last verse of Judges, it says that there was no king in those days, and everyone did as they saw fit. There's a famine in the land, and it's because Israel has not held up their end of the deal. This is a covenant God. It's a covenant God. This is a very desperate time. There's no food in the land. So what do you do? What do you do when there's no food and you're starving and your family's starving? It says this man here, so a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, they went to live for a while in the country of Moab. This man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. And as Bible students, we should ask ourselves, okay, where's Moab and who is Moab? And interesting enough, you'll have to, again, go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. And you remember, God calls Abraham and he tells him to leave your country and leave your family and leave all your possessions. And as he's following God and going where God tells him to, he's being blessed and his herds are growing and growing. And if you remember, somebody's with him. And this man's name is Lot. And it's Abraham's nephew, and Abraham's nephew is traveling, and he's following with Abraham. They're doing what God asked him to do, and his herd begins to grow. Matter of fact, their herds begin to grow so much that the land could no longer support both their herds, and even their herdsmen begin to fight with one another. And it gets to the point where Abraham basically says, hey, listen, you go ahead and look around, and you decide the land that you want to settle in, and I'm just going to trust God, and I'll find another place, right? And that's basically how it shouldn't go, right? I mean, Abraham's the uncle, and he's the one that God's making the promises to, but Abraham or Lot does what he sees would be good, and Abraham just trusts God, and he picks a place, and we know how that turns out because he ends up in the whole Sodom and Gomorrah deal, right? Then he leaves there, and his wife, they're told not to look back, and she looks back, and so he ends up with just him and his 2 daughters. And unfortunately, there's an incestuous experience that happens, and there's an offspring, and his name is Moab. And God says, stay away from those people. Don't go nowhere near them. Don't go where they live. And even before they go into the land, God says, stay away from them. Don't have anything to do. As a matter of fact, if you marry one of them, you're going to have to be away from God's people for 4 generations. So what do you do when there's no food? What do you do when you're starving? What do you do when you're desperate? Well, you really shouldn't do what Elimelech did, because he decides to go to Moab. Go to the enemy. Go to the very place where God says, don't go there. Don't go there. And then his sons happen to be the age where they're going to marry. And you know who else comes from Moab? Do you remember the story of Balak and Balaam? Those on Wednesday night, remember Roy kind of wanted us to study that whole deal out. So we did. So we just got studied up on it not too long ago. But if you remember in Numbers chapter 20, there's this king, and it's the king of Moab. And God's people are all around, and he begins to look at God's people, and he wants to destroy them. So he calls this man Balaam, who's a prophet, and he has the whole deal with his donkey. You know, we don't have to go through all that again. But at the end of do you know what Balaam finally tells them? He says, listen, if you want to destroy the people of God, you know what you need to do? You need to offer your women to them. Because if they marry them, they will worship your God. And if they worship your God, you won't have to destroy them. Matter of fact, their own God is going to judge them and destroy them. Yet this is the place where Elimelech decides to go because there's a famine in the land of Canaan where God has given them. And the reason the famine is there because they haven't obeyed God and trusted God. Right? This is becoming a mess. Right? Now look how it works out here in verse 3. Now verse 3 it says, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, he died. And she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. Now, Israelites, what they're supposed to do, if they're in another country, they're supposed to send their children back to the land of God and marry people from God's people. And when we think, they're only about 30 miles away. I know we didn't have cars and all that, but they're not very far. But once again, we have some bad decision making. And so, it says they married Moabite women. One was named Orpha, and the other's name was Ruth. And they had lived there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left with her 2 sons and her husband. Man, this is a wonderful story. We love the story of Ruth, don't we? I mean, this is a beautiful story of redemption. And we know about Ruth and Boaz and the guardian redeemer and all that God does. But to even get to the good stuff, man, we've got to get through all of that. And I've read this story so many times, and when I get to verse 6, what I hadn't never realized before is the brokenness of the hurt, of the loss of life, of sin, of the ungodliness, and even this word here, not just bad decision making, but direct and absolute and direct defiance of God and His Word. And yet God is powerful enough to work through all of that for His purpose. Man, He's a redeemer. Man, I mean, this God is a redeemer. He's a redeemer of brokenness and failure and defiance and ungodliness and death and destruction. Matter of fact, have you ever heard this before? I've heard it a lot of times, but this story really gave me a different meaning. That God can take a mess and turn it into a message. Man, because this is a beautiful message in this book. And man, this man, Amalek, has really created a heck of a mess. But see, God is powerful enough to even do that. You ever feel like you're messing things up? Man, this God can fix anyone's mess. What do you do then? Did you get to this point where maybe you've kind of wandered away from God? Maybe you've made some bad decisions. Maybe desperate times have called for desperate measures. And as you're God's people, I don't think we're ever supposed to go down that road. But as they do, what do you do then when life falls apart? When everything goes sideways? When your dreams and hopes and visions and everything is gone? What should God's people do? And as I looked at 6 to the rest of this chapter, I saw something I had never seen before. And I feel like God is really preaching a strong message here. Probably even more of a warning. I think the Jews would probably read this and would have seen things that I had never seen before and realized, like, wow, these guys really messed up. I mean, these guys really had gone off the deep end here, but we know what God's going to do. But what do you do? What do you do when you compromise? Because even the kids, after the dad dies, when they know what they should do, and they compromise. Once again, they take matter into their own hands. Hey, and let's be honest, I think we've all maybe not done anything like this, but all of us in desperate times have kind of taken matters into your own hands. I mean, in desperate times, have your eyes of faith ever kind of shut? And then you just kind of start to look at things at a practical standpoint, I think this is just what needs to be done. I mean, I can even think of times where there's just difficult people kind of getting in the way, and I really need this to happen over here. And sometimes I say, I know I'm supposed to love my enemies, I know, but in this situation, I really need this to happen. And maybe you push a little bit harder than you should, or handle things in a way that maybe you shouldn't handle it. And guess what happens? A lot of times it doesn't work out the way that you think it is, or things can come apart. No matter what, when I stop here at this moment, I realize that things in life did not go anywhere near the way that they planned. So what do? As a believer in God, and as I read through this message, the same word over and over again is used for the rest of the chapter. And we know in English they'll tell you, like writing, I like to write, they'll say, don't use the same word over and over again, right? Try and use it differently. And I think God purposely does this in a context. When you see the same word, at least in the Hebrew, you should pay attention to it. And the word is this, to return. From verses 6 on, as this message happened, what I see is this word over and over again. It's the word shuv. It's the Hebrew word shuv, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correctly because Hebrew is a pretty challenging word. But in verse 6 on, the word over and over again. Verse 6, it says this, Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. So what would have probably should have been done? How about just walk by faith and God's going to come through for you, instead of taking matter into your own hands? But it says this, when she hears this, it says, she and her daughter-in-law prepared to return home, return to God, and to return to his people. Verse 7, with her two daughters-in-law, she left a place where she had been living and set out to the road where she would be taken back to the land of Judah. Go back to God and go back to his people. It says this, Then Naomi said to the two daughters, return, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in a home of another husband. Then they kissed them. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept out loud. And she said to her, we will go back with you to your people. They'll return. Verse 11 says this, and Naomi said, home, my daughters, why would you come with me? I am going to have any more sons who could become your husbands. There's the word again, home. Go back to God and his people. It says, my daughters, I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and they gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord has turned against me. Verse 14, it says, and this they wept out loud. Again, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Verse 15 says, look, and Naomi, your sister-in-law, is Go back to her people and her gods. Man, look at that. Man, look what God is really so powerful that these people, and Ruth wants to go back to God's people, to go back to where God would want them, and yet Naomi's saying, no, go back to your own gods. Go back to your own people. Man, I stopped this to realize and think about this so much. Man, Israel was supposed to be a light to the Gentile people. Just as God's church, they weren't supposed to go over here and associate and be a part of it, but they were always supposed to be a light in calling people back to his people and to become a part of the Jewish religion. And yet she's trying to stop Ruth from doing it. Man, but here's the beautiful thing about it. God is so powerful, he can work through all those things. Right? God can still push his purpose. Humans cannot stop the kingdom and his purposes from being fulfilled. Verse 15, it says, look, said Naomi, it says, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to not leave with you and to shoo from you. You were to go, where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will be buried. May the Lord deal with me. But if ever But it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. But of course, we know those are the most famous verses of Ruth, and they're very beautiful. But in the context, there's this over and over. Even if you get down in verse 22, so Naomi returned. There's that word "shu" from Moab, accompanied from Ruth and the Moabite, and her daughter-in-law arrived in Bethlehem as the barley harvest had begun. Over and over, there's this word, and it's called return, to return, to return. No matter how far you begin to turn away from this God, no matter how deep it is, no matter what it is, no matter any person of God, the answer is always this: return to God and His people. Return to God and His people. Return to God and His people. Right? And here's the thing that hit me so hard when I think about all the decisions and things that had happened, all that humans and how God's people had messed it up. And even this woman at this point is trying to stop somebody from coming back to Jerusalem and becoming a part of worshiping the one true God. Is even that can't stop God's purposes. You get to the end of this book, and we know what happens, right? God can take a mess and turn it into a message. Doesn't matter how bad the mess is. Right? Matter of fact, he can take this mess right here, and guess what he can turn it into? The Messiah. Right? He can take this mess, all that they've done and all that they've created here, and yet God, what does God turn this into? He turns this into a story of redemption. He turns this into the bloodline. You know, you get to the end of the book, right? And when I turn back here to verse 16, it says that Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The woman living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. And his father was the father of Jesse and the father of David. And we know where that goes, right? We got all the genealogies of the Bible. We get tired of reading them, but we know all this is leading to Jesus. God was able to work through all this mess, through all this defiance, through all this sin. And at the end of the day, what God is able to produce is the Messiah. You know, sometimes we can look at human beings and go, man, they're messing everything up, man. Like God's kingdom, His purposes. I mean, I don't know how all this is going to work out, but yet God is able to work through everything. God can take the worst messes, no matter who we look at. I mean, of course, we number one, we got to look at our own lives. But no matter what we look around at the world, no matter what type of mess we see being made, man, God's so powerful, He can turn that into a message. Matter of fact, He could even bring the Messiah. He could even carry out His kingdom through these things, man. There is nothing that this God cannot do. He is truly a God of redemption. And even when we might mess things up and we might take things into our own hands, and we can stop walking by faith and start walking by sight because it looks like that's what needs to be done. No matter how far you go, the message is always this: return to God and His people. Return to God and His people. Return to God and His people. God is good. If there's anything we can do for you, we're willing here to serve you anytime that we can. God is good.